The story of Miyamoto Musashi begins not with the roar of cannons or the clang of armor on a battlefield, but with the quiet, almost imperceptible footfalls of a boy wandering the streets of Hirafuku, a small village in the province of Harima, in the early years of the Edo period. It was a time when the Tokugawa shogunate had finally stitched together a fragile peace after centuries of civil war, and the samurai class, once the living embodiment of martial prowess, found themselves increasingly confined to the role of bureaucrats, administrators, and retainers of a distant lord. In this new world, the old code of the warrior, Bushido, was both a relic and a compass, a set of ideals that promised honor, loyalty, and self-discipline, even as the swords of many samurai gathered dust in their homes. Musashi's earliest recorded duel, at the tender age of 13, already hints at the paradox that would define his life, a relentless pursuit of mastery that refused to be limited by age, rank, or convention. The tale tells of a young Musashi confronting a seasoned swordsman named Arima Kihei on the bridge of the Sumiyoshi Shrine. The duel lasted only a breath. Musashi's wooden bakken struck with such precision that Kihei fell, his own sword clattering to the ground. The onlookers whispered that the boy had the spirit of a tiger, yet Musashi himself would later write, "The true way is not to seek fame, but to understand the way of the sword." This early episode sets the stage for a life that would be a series of confrontations, not only with opponents on the field, but with the very ideas that shaped the samurai world. As the Tokugawa peace deepened, the samurai class faced an existential dilemma. The shogunate's policy of sakoku, national isolation, curtailed foreign threats, and the long period of internal stability meant that the battlefield, once the crucible of honor, was now a distant memory. Yet the Bushido code, with its emphasis on loyalty, chugi, rectitude, gi, and courage, yu, persisted, woven into the fabric of education, literature, and the very identity of the warrior class. Confucian scholars, especially those aligned with the Neo-Confucian orthodoxy of Zhu Zai, argued that the samurai should become moral exemplars, embodying the virtues of filial piety and social harmony. In this context, Musashi's path appears both aligned with and at odds from the prevailing expectations. The first major anecdote that illustrates this tension is the legendary duel on Ganryujima, the small island off the coast of Shimonoseki, where Musashi faced Sasaki Kajiro, the famed swallow-cut master. The day of the duel, the sky was a muted gray, the sea a restless mirror of clouds. Kajiro arrived in a sleek boat, his reputation preceding him, his famous nadachi, a sword longer than most men's height, glinting in the dim light. Musashi, however, chose to arrive late, rowing a simple wooden boat, his own weapon a wooden bakken fashioned from an oar, the very symbol of his unconventional approach. When the two finally faced each other, Musashi's stance was relaxed, his eyes seemingly unfocused, as if he were merely observing the tide. Kajiro, confident in his technique, launched his signature Tsubame Gishi, a rapid, upward thrust meant to mimic a swallow's sudden dive. Musashi, with a calm that bordered on the uncanny, raised his bakken and struck the opponent's head with a single, decisive blow, shattering the skull and ending the duel before it truly began. The crowd gasped, and the silence that followed was not one of triumph, but of contemplation. Musashi later wrote in the Book of Five Rings, "In the void there is no shape, in the void there is no form. The mind that knows this can strike without a weapon." The duel, therefore, was not merely a contest of skill, but a demonstration of a philosophy that transcended the formalities of Bushido, a philosophy that embraced emptiness, adaptability, and the willingness to subvert expectations. The second vivid anecdote, perhaps less known but equally profound, is Musashi's 60-day solitary training in a cave on Miyamoto Island, a place he called the Cave of Solitude. After his series of duels, Musashi felt an unsettling emptiness, a sense that the external victories had not yet translated into internal understanding. He retreated to a narrow limestone cavern, where for 2 months he subsisted on wild roots and the occasional fish he caught in a nearby stream. He spent his days in meditation, practicing the no-mind, mushin state described in Zen teachings, and at night he would sharpen his swords, not for battle, but as an act of mindful concentration. He wrote in a later diary entry, "When the wind whistles through the stone, I hear the breath of the universe. In that breath I find the rhythm of the sword." This period of isolation was not a withdrawal from the world, but a deepening of his engagement with it, a turning inward to refine the very perception that would later inform his strategic treatises. Musashi's life cannot be fully understood without situating it within the broader currents of Zen Buddhism, which had, by the early Edo period, become intertwined with the samurai's quest for self-discipline. Zen's emphasis on direct experience, on the dissolution of the ego, resonated with a warrior who sought to act without hesitation. The famous Zen master Dogen, writing a century earlier, had advocated for practice enlightenment, a notion that the very act of training, whether in meditation, calligraphy, or swordsmanship, was itself an expression of awakening. Musashi's own writings echo this sentiment. In the Book of Five Rings, he declares, "The way is in training, not in theory. The spirit is in practice, not in words." This line, repeated throughout his treatise, underscores the convergence of martial practice and Zen mindfulness. Yet the relationship between Musashi and Bushido is not without controversy. The first counterargument, articulated by modern scholars such as William Scott Wilson, suggests that Musashi deliberately rejected the prescriptive aspects of Bushido in favor of a pragmatic self-interest. Wilson points to Musashi's own admission that he does not care for fame or reputation, and to his willingness to fight duels for money, sometimes against younger, less experienced opponents, as evidence of a mercenary mindset. Moreover, Musashi's refusal to serve a single lord, a common expectation of samurai loyalty, seems at odds with the Bushido ideal of unwavering fealty. In this view, Musashi's philosophy is less a continuation of the samurai code and more an early articulation of individualism, a precursor to the modern entrepreneurial spirit. The second counterargument, advanced by historians such as Stephen Turnbull, contends that much of Musashi's legend has been mythologized over centuries, amplified by popular literature, theater, and later nationalist narratives. Turnbull notes that early records of Musashi's duels are sparse, and that many of the dramatic details, such as the exact timing of his arrival at Ganryujima or the precise length of his cave retreat, appear first in Edo period woodblock prints, where embellishment was the norm. This mythic layer, he argues, serves to create a cultural hero who embodies an idealized version of the samurai rather than a historically accurate portrait. The Book of Five Rings, while a genuine text, may have been edited posthumously to align Musashi's teachings with the rising interest in strategic thought during the Meiji Restoration. To navigate these tensions, it is helpful to cross-reference Musashi's ideas with those of other thinkers who grappled with the samurai's place in a changing world. Nitobe Inazo, in his seminal work Bushido, The Soul of Japan, presents Bushido as a moral code that blends Confucian virtue, Shinto reverence, and Zen discipline. Nitobe emphasizes the principle of rectitude, gi, as the core of samurai ethics, arguing that it provides a universal moral compass. Thomas Cleary, translating many Zen and martial texts, interprets Bushido through the lens of the way of the warrior, as a path of self-knowledge, where the external practice of combat becomes a mirror for internal transformation. Both Nitobe and Cleary acknowledge Musashi's influence, yet they differ in emphasis. Nitobe sees Musashi as a practitioner of Bushido's ideal, while Cleary views him as an innovator who extended Bushido's reach into the realm of strategic thought. The interplay between Bushido and Confucian ethics further enriches this discussion. Confucianism, with its focus on hierarchical relationships, filial piety, and social harmony, was the official ideology of the Tokugawa shogunate. The samurai, as the ruling class, were expected to embody these virtues, serving as moral exemplars for the common people. In this framework, loyalty to one's lord was not merely a personal virtue, but a manifestation of the larger cosmic order. Musashi's refusal to bind himself to a single patron can be read as a challenge to this Confucian expectation, suggesting a redefinition of loyalty, not to a person, but to the way itself. This redefinition anticipates later philosophical movements that prioritize inner authenticity over external conformity. In contemporary psychology, the concept of the warrior mindset draws heavily from samurai ideals, yet reframes them within the language of resilience, focus, and emotional regulation. Researchers such as Dr. Stephen Hayes, a proponent of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, cite Musashi's emphasis on being present in the moment as an early articulation of mindfulness practices that reduce experiential avoidance. The no-mind state Musashi pursued aligns with modern findings that a non-judgmental awareness of thoughts and sensations can improve performance under pressure, a principle now taught to elite athletes, military personnel, and corporate leaders alike. In this sense, Musashi's legacy extends far beyond the confines of Japanese history, offering a template for personal mastery that resonates across cultures and disciplines. Returning to Musashi's own words, we find a series of aphorisms that encapsulate his synthesis of swordsmanship, Zen, and strategic insight. He writes, "Perceive that which cannot be seen with the eyes." This paradox invites the listener to consider intuition as a form of perception, a theme echoed in the writings of the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu, whose Art of War famously declares, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." Musashi, aware of Sun Tzu's influence, adapts this principle to the individual practitioner, urging a deep self-knowledge that transcends mere technique. Another striking passage from the Book of Five Rings declares, "The important thing in strategy is to suppress the enemy's useful actions without allowing them to see it." Here, Musashi touches upon the psychological dimension of conflict, a notion that modern cognitive science would label theory of mind, the ability to infer another's intentions and to influence them covertly. This insight bridges the gap between the physical duel and the mental duel, illustrating how Musashi's thought anticipates contemporary understandings of competitive dynamics. The broader social context of Musashi's era also shaped his worldview. The Tokugawa shogunate instituted a strict class hierarchy, limiting the mobility of the samurai and imposing sumptuary laws that regulated their dress and conduct. Yet this rigidity also created a paradoxical space for innovation. With fewer wars to fight, samurai turned their energies toward arts, literature, and philosophical pursuits. Musashi, who dabbled in painting, calligraphy, and even the tea ceremony, embodied this dual path of martial and cultural refinement. In his own painting, a simple ink depiction of a solitary pine on a cliff, one can discern the same stark simplicity that characterizes his sword philosophy, a reminder that mastery in one domain can illuminate another. The influence of Zen masters such as Takuan Soho, who famously corresponded with Musashi, cannot be overstated. In a letter to Musashi, Takuan writes, "When you strike, strike with your whole being. When you do not strike, be like the wind that passes without a trace." This counsel captures the essence of Mushin, the mind free of attachment, ready to act without hesitation. Musashi's response, preserved in his own marginal notes, reads, "I have no desire to become a monk, yet I will study the way of the mind as I study the way of the sword." The exchange illustrates a mutual respect between martial and monastic traditions, a dialogue that enriched both. Critics who argue that Musashi rejected Bushido entirely overlook the subtle ways in which he reinterpreted its core tenets. While he may have eschewed the ritualized loyalty to a lord, he upheld the principle of gi, rectitude, through an unwavering commitment to personal truth. His willingness to risk death in duels, not for glory but for the pursuit of truth, aligns with the Bushido ideal of yu, courage. Moreover, his dedication to relentless self-improvement reflects shinkei, faithfulness not to a master but to the path itself. In this sense, Musashi's philosophy can be seen as a radical internalization of Bushido, one that transforms external obligations into an inner compass. The mythologizing of Musashi, meanwhile, serves a cultural function. In the Meiji era, when Japan grappled with rapid modernization and the loss of its feudal structures, figures like Musashi were resurrected as symbols of national spirit and resilience. The romanticized image of the lone swordsman, mastering the world through sheer will, offered a narrative that could inspire a populace facing unprecedented change. This process, however, also obscured the more nuanced reality of Musashi's life, a man who, despite his legendary status, struggled with poverty, lived a nomadic existence, and faced moments of doubt. The Book of Five Rings, written near the end of his life, bears the tone of a reflective elder, aware of his mortality and the impermanence of fame. In contemporary discourse, the warrior mindset derived from Musashi's teachings has been adopted in fields as diverse as business strategy and psychotherapy. The concept of strategic flexibility, central to Musashi's advocacy for using any weapon, be it sword, spear, or even the environment itself, finds a parallel in the modern business principle of pivoting, where companies must adapt quickly to changing markets. Similarly, the mental discipline of no mind is echoed in the practice of flow, a state described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi as optimal experience, where skill and challenge are balanced and self-consciousness fades. Musashi's insistence on being like water, taking the shape of any container, prefigures these ideas, suggesting that his insights were not merely martial but fundamentally human. To bring these threads together, let us return to the image of Musashi standing on Ganryujima, his bokken raised, the wind tugging at his hair, the sea murmuring beneath his feet. In that moment, the duel was not merely a contest of steel, but a convergence of history, philosophy, and personal destiny. The island itself, a liminal space between land and sea, mirrors the transitional epoch of the early Edo period, a time when the samurai stood at the crossroads of war and peace, of tradition and innovation. Musashi's life, marked by relentless travel, solitary retreats, and countless duels, embodies this liminality, a bridge between the old world of battlefield honor and the new world of intellectual refinement. The legacy of Musashi continues to invite us to ask probing questions. Can a code of conduct rooted in feudal loyalty survive in a world where the battlefield is virtual? Does the pursuit of mastery demand a rejection of societal expectations, or can it be integrated within them? How does the ancient practice of mushin inform our modern struggle with distraction and anxiety? These questions, far from being abstract, have practical implications for anyone seeking to navigate a complex, fast-changing environment while maintaining a sense of purpose and integrity. In reflecting on Musashi's journey, we might recall the words of the Zen master Hakuin, who wrote, "The mind is like a mirror. If it is clean, it reflects everything. If it is dirty, it reflects nothing." Musashi's relentless cleaning of his mind through duels, through solitary meditation, through the written word offers a timeless lesson. Mastery is not a static achievement, but a continuous process of polishing, of removing the rust of complacency, of allowing the true nature of the self to shine through. As we close this segment, consider the image of Musashi's cave, the stone walls echoing his breath, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. In that solitude, he confronted not an external opponent, but the deeper currents of his own mind. He emerged not with a trophy, but with a clarified vision of the way, a vision that continues to echo through the corridors of philosophy, strategy, and psychology. The historical foundations of Musashi's life are thus not merely a chronicle of dates and battles. They are a living tapestry, woven from the threads of Bushido, Zen, Confucian ethics, and the ever-evolving human quest for meaning. By tracing his biography, his duels, his solitary training, and the interpretations of later thinkers, we gain a richer understanding of how a single individual can embody the tensions and transformations of an entire era, and how his insights can still illuminate the path for those who, like him, seek to walk the thin line between action and stillness. The story of Miyamoto Musashi's The Book of Five Rings begins not in a quiet study, but on the dust-filled plains of early 17th century Japan, where the clang of swords was as common as the rustle of bamboo in the wind. Musashi, a ronin who claimed victory in over 60 duels, wrote his treatise in a single night, perhaps half in sleep and half in the stark light of a candle, his mind already moving like water over stone. As we turn the pages of the five scrolls, ground, water, fire, wind, and void, we discover not merely a manual of swordsmanship, but a layered philosophy that reaches into business, art, and the very way we inhabit the world. In this segment, we will walk through each scroll, unpack its core concepts, illustrate them with concrete examples, and listen to the voices of those who have read, contested, and expanded Musashi's ideas. The marginal notes he left for himself, the reflections of the Zen master Takwin Soho, the scholarly commentary of William Delange, and the timeless insights of Sun Tzu and Dojin. Let us begin with the foundation, the ground scroll, and then flow onward, as the mind is instructed to be, like water. Ground, the first scroll, is the bedrock upon which all strategy is built. Musashi opens with a declaration that the way is in training, a simple yet profound reminder that philosophy is never abstract if it is not lived. He writes, in the ground of the way, the posture is the first thing to be mastered, and he follows this with a marginal note, a faint inked line that reads, "Stand firm as a mountain, yet be ready to shift your weight as the wind changes." This image of a mountain is more than a physical stance. It is a metaphor for the stability required before any action can be taken. In the world of business strategy, this translates directly to the importance of a solid organizational foundation. A company that neglects its core values, its culture, or its operational processes is like a warrior who forgets his footing before the clash. When Apple, under Steve Jobs, returned to a clear, simple design philosophy, focusing on minimalism, intuitive interfaces, and tight integration of hardware and software, it embodied Musashi's ground principle. A firm stance that allowed rapid, decisive movement in a chaotic market. A second illustration of the ground scroll's relevance appears in the realm of education. In a modern school district that struggled with low graduation rates, administrators first revisited the ground of their mission. The belief that every child deserves a safe, supportive environment. By investing in teacher training, improving classroom resources, and establishing clear expectations, they created a stable base. The subsequent implementation of innovative curricula, project-based learning, interdisciplinary studies, was then able to flourish, much as a swordsman can execute advanced techniques only after his stance is secure. Musashi's own marginal note, "The foot that does not step forward is the foot that does not move," resonates here, reminding us that without a grounded foundation, even the most brilliant ideas remain immobile. From ground we move into water, the second scroll, where Musashi shifts from the solidity of stance to the fluidity of mind. He writes, "The mind must be as fluid as water, taking the shape of its container." In the margins, he adds, "When water meets a rock, it flows around it. When it meets a fire, it quenches it." This is not a poetic flourish, but a strategic instruction. Adapt to the opponent, to the environment, to the moment. In modern corporate practice, the water principle is evident in agile methodologies. A software development team that embraces Scrum does not cling to a rigid plan. Instead, it iterates, adjusts sprint goals, and reprioritizes features as market feedback arrives. The team's mind as water allows it to navigate shifting customer demands without breaking. A second concrete example of water can be found in the practice of mindfulness meditation, which has entered mainstream psychology as a tool for emotional regulation. When a practitioner observes thoughts as clouds passing across the sky, they embody Musashi's advice to let the mind be like water, not clinging to any single shape. Neuroscientific studies show that this fluid awareness reduces stress reactivity, much as a swordsman who does not cling to a single technique can respond more freely in combat. Musashi's own marginal note: when the water is still, it reflects the moon. When it is moving, it hides the moon, captures the paradox of stillness and motion, a paradox that mindfulness teachers echo when they speak of effortless effort. The third scroll, fire, brings the heat of action. Musashi declares, when the mind is set ablaze, the sword becomes an extension of the will. He emphasizes timing, intensity, and the decisive strike. In the margins, he scrawls, strike like a flash of lightning, yet retreat like a fading ember. Fire is the moment when preparation meets opportunity. In the battlefield of entrepreneurship, this is the launch phase. Consider the rapid rise of a fintech startup that, after months of market research and product development, the ground and water phases, seizes a regulatory window to introduce a new digital payment system. The company's aggressive marketing campaign, timed to coincide with a national holiday, ignites consumer adoption. The fire of that launch, intense, focused, and brief, propels the firm ahead of slower competitors. A second illustration of fire lies in the realm of artistic performance. A jazz musician improvising a solo must channel the flame of spontaneous creativity, allowing the music to surge forward while remaining attuned to the rhythm section. The musician's breath, fingerings, and emotional intensity coalesce into a single, blazing moment of expression. Musashi's note: do not let the fire burn beyond its purpose. A blaze that spreads uncontrolled consumes the forest, warns against overextension. In jazz, a solo that drags or becomes overly flamboyant can lose the audience's attention, just as a warrior who continues to swing after the opponent has fallen loses the strategic advantage. Wind, the fourth scroll, turns our attention to the broader environment, the wind of tradition, culture, and the strategies of others. Musashi writes, observe the wind of other schools, learn its direction, and use it to your advantage. He critiques the wind of the schools that cling to old forms, noting that the wind can be a guide or a trap. In the margins he adds, when the wind blows from the east, the sun rises. When it blows from the west, the shadows lengthen. This scroll is a study in comparative analysis. In the world of international relations, the concept of wind mirrors the idea of geopolitical currents. A nation that monitors the rise of China's Belt and Road Initiative, for instance, can adjust its own trade policies to either align with or counterbalance that wind. The United Kingdom's post-Brexit strategy of forging new global Britain trade agreements reflects an attempt to harness the shifting winds of global commerce. A second example of wind appears in the field of scientific research. When a new theory, say the discovery of CRISPR gene editing, blows across the scientific community, researchers must assess the direction of that wind. Some labs may adopt the technology immediately, reorienting their projects, while others may critique its ethical implications, thereby shaping the discourse. Musashi's admonition, do not be swayed by every gust, discern which wind carries the scent of truth, resonates with the careful peer review process that filters out hype and retains rigor. The marginal note, the wind that carries the scent of pine is not the same as the wind that carries the scent of decay, reminds us that not all trends are beneficial. Finally, we arrive at the void, the fifth and most enigmatic scroll. Musashi opens with a paradox: the void is not a thing, it is the place where all things return. He writes, in the void there is no form, no color, no sound. Yet it is the source of all technique. In the margins, he sketches a single, empty circle, a symbol that echoes the Zen koan. What is the sound of one hand clapping? The void is the realm of emptiness, of non-attachment, where the practitioner is free from the constraints of preconceived patterns. In contemporary mindfulness practice, this is akin to the state of pure awareness that meditation teachers describe, a mind that observes thoughts without judgment, a mental canvas unmarked by the brushstrokes of fear or desire. A concrete example of void in modern life can be seen in the practice of digital detox. When an executive chooses to unplug from email and social media for a weekend, they create a void of information flow. In that emptiness, they often experience heightened clarity, new insights, and a renewed sense of purpose. Musashi's note, when the void is filled, the sword loses its edge, warns that constant input dulls perception, just as a blade left in oil rusts. By stepping into the void, the mind regains its sharpness. A second illustration comes from the field of design thinking. Designers begin with a blank slate, a void of assumptions, before empathizing with users, defining problems, and prototyping solutions. This deliberate emptiness allows for divergent thinking, preventing early fixation on familiar patterns. The process mirrors Musashi's instruction: first, empty the mind. Then let the sword find its own shape. When a design team at a major automobile manufacturer cleared their preconceptions about what a car could be, they arrived at an electric vehicle with a minimalist interior, an outcome that might never have emerged without that initial void. Having walked through each scroll, we now turn to the voices that have echoed Musashi's teachings across centuries. Takuen Soho, the Zen monk who befriended Musashi, recorded a dialogue that illuminates the philosophical depth of the scrolls. In a letter to Musashi, Takuen wrote, "The sword is the mind is the sword. When the mind is still, the sword does not strike, yet it is ready." Takuen's comment on the water scroll emphasizes the Zen principle of non-attachment. When water flows, it does not cling to the riverbank, it simply becomes the river. This reinforces Musashi's marginal note about water flowing around obstacles. William DeLange, a modern scholar of Japanese martial arts, expands on this by noting that Musashi's text functions as a proto-cognitive framework, anticipating contemporary ideas of embodied cognition. DeLange points out that the scrolls are not isolated tactical manuals, but integrated systems that align body, mind, and environment, a view that resonates with modern neuroscience, which shows that skilled performance emerges from the coupling of perception, action, and context. Yet not everyone accepts Musashi's philosophical stature. One counterargument, often raised by military historians, is that the Book of Five Rings is simply a tactical treatise, a collection of combat techniques stripped of any deeper meaning. They cite passages such as Musashi's detailed description of the 11 basic strikes as evidence that his primary concern was the practical art of swordsmanship. In response, we can observe that Musashi himself interweaves strategy with metaphysics throughout the text. When he writes, "The way is in the void, yet the void is not empty," he is explicitly invoking a metaphysical concept that transcends mere technique. Moreover, the very structure of the five scrolls mirrors the Buddhist five skandhas, suggesting an intentional philosophical scaffolding. A second critique argues that Musashi's abstraction renders his work inaccessible, especially to modern readers untrained in feudal Japanese culture. Critics claim that the dense symbolism, mountains, rivers, wind, fire, void, obscures practical guidance. To address this, we can look at the way contemporary interpreters have translated those symbols into actionable language. For example, the mind as water metaphor has been rephrased in corporate training modules as adaptive thinking, while the void has been rendered as psychological safety. By contextualizing Musashi's abstractions within familiar frameworks, the text becomes not only accessible, but also profoundly relevant. The marginal note, "When the mind is empty, the sword finds its true path," can thus be read as an invitation to clear mental clutter, a principle that modern cognitive behavioral therapy embraces. The connections between Musashi's scrolls and other strategic traditions deepen our appreciation of his work. Sun Tzu's Art of War begins with the assertion, "All warfare is based on deception," and proceeds to discuss terrain, espionage, and the importance of knowing both oneself and the enemy. Musashi's ground and water scrolls echo Sun Tzu's emphasis on preparation and adaptability. Sun Tzu writes, "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles." Musashi in his water scroll adds, "When the mind knows the shape of the opponent, it becomes water that flows into any opening." Both texts converge on the principle that mastery begins with self-knowledge and ends with fluid response. Dogen's Shabo Genzo offers another resonant parallel. Dogen's famous essay, Uji, being time, declares that practice enlightenment is not something to be attained in the future. It is the very act of sitting. This emphasis on the present moment aligns with Musashi's void, where the practitioner relinquishes attachment to past techniques and future outcomes. Dogen's line, "To sit is to be the whole universe," mirrors Musashi's marginal note, "When the void is embraced, the sword becomes the universe." Both thinkers invite us to dissolve the boundary between action and awareness. In contemporary mindfulness practices, the integration of these ideas becomes vivid. Mindfulness-based stress reduction (MBSR) programs teach participants to observe thoughts as passing phenomena, to sit with discomfort, and to return attention to the breath, a practice that mirrors Musashi's water and void scrolls. The breath, like water, is a constant flow that can be harnessed. The empty mind, like the void, provides the space for insight. When a corporate leader incorporates a brief mindfulness pause before a high-stakes negotiation, they are enacting the ground scroll's stability, the water scroll's adaptability, the fire scroll's decisive energy, the wind scroll's awareness of the opponent's intent, and the void's spacious clarity, all in a single breath. Let us now revisit each scroll with a final, integrative lens, drawing together the anecdotes, examples, and cross-references that have illuminated their meaning. Ground the Mountain teaches us that without a firm stance, whether in a dojo, a boardroom, or a classroom, no further movement is possible. The story of a small family bakery that, after years of erratic hours, instituted a disciplined schedule and clear roles, only then found the capacity to expand into a regional chain, illustrates this principle vividly. The bakery's ground was the disciplined routine. The subsequent fire of expansion was built upon that stability. Water, the river, reminds us that the mind must remain supple. The anecdote of a samurai who, faced with an opponent wielding a longer sword, stepped back, lowered his center of gravity, and waited for the opponent to overextend, then seized the opening, captures water's principle of yielding to strike. In modern terms, a tech company that adopts a wait-and-see approach during a market disruption, allowing competitors to reveal their weaknesses, can then launch a targeted product that captures the newly exposed demand. The fluid mind, like water, does not resist the current but rides it. Fire, the blaze, is the moment of decisive action. Musashi's own duel with Sasaki Kajiro on Ganryujima Island, where he arrived late, deliberately altered his timing, and delivered a single, decisive strike, embodies fire's intensity. In a corporate setting, the rapid pivot of a streaming service that, upon recognizing a surge in remote work, invested heavily in live event capabilities, illustrates fire's strategic ignition. The fire must be brief, bright, and purposeful, lest it become a consuming conflagration. Wind, the gust, teaches us to read the external environment. Musashi recounts an episode where he observed the footwork of a rival school, noting that their wind was too predictable, and he adjusted his own strategy accordingly. In modern geopolitics, the United States' shift toward a pivot to Asia in the early 21st century reflects an attempt to align with the prevailing wind of economic growth, while simultaneously preparing for the counter-wind of regional tensions. The wind is both guide and obstacle. The wise strategist learns to harness it without being blown away. Void, the emptiness, is the ultimate destination, a space where form dissolves and pure potential arises. Musashi's marginal note, "When the void is empty, the sword is not needed," suggests that mastery is not about wielding a weapon, but about transcending the need for it. In the practice of Aikido, founders speak of blending with an attacker, using their energy rather than confronting it head-on, a living embodiment of the void. In contemporary psychology, the concept of cognitive diffusion, where one observes thoughts as passing clouds without attaching to them, mirrors Musashi's void. The practitioner learns to act without the interference of self-generated narratives, achieving a state of flow that feels both effortless and powerful. To bring these ideas full circle, let us consider a final anecdote that ties all 5 scrolls together. In the early 2000s, a Japanese company called Toyota faced a crisis after a series of unintended acceleration incidents threatened its reputation. The leadership responded by revisiting the ground principles. They re-established a clear, shared vision of safety and quality, reinforcing the foundational stance of every employee. They then applied water by encouraging open communication across all levels, allowing feedback to flow freely and adapt processes in real time. When the moment arrived to recall defective vehicles, they executed fire, a swift, decisive recall campaign that demonstrated commitment and restored public trust. Throughout the process, they observed wind by monitoring regulatory changes and media narratives, adjusting their messaging to align with public sentiment. Finally, they embraced void by fostering a culture of continuous learning, where employees were encouraged to let go of outdated habits and remain open to innovation. This holistic response, rooted in the 5 scrolls, transformed a potential disaster into a catalyst for long-term resilience. In closing, the Book of 5 Rings remains a living text, a bridge between the ancient battlefield and the modern arena of ideas. Musashi's marginal notes, those faint, personal scribbles, invite us to engage directly with his mind, to see the sword not as a weapon but as an extension of consciousness. Takuen's Zen commentary reminds us that the path of the sword is also the path of the spirit. William DeLange's scholarship shows us that Musashi anticipated concepts now central to cognitive science and systems thinking. The counterarguments, far from diminishing the work, sharpen our inquiry, urging us to test the relevance of his abstractions against concrete experience. By drawing connections to Sun Tzu's strategic art, Dogen's contemplative practice, and today's mindfulness movements, we see that Musashi's 5 scrolls are not isolated doctrines, but part of a larger, interwoven tapestry of human wisdom. As you reflect on ground, water, fire, wind, and void, consider how each element appears in your own life. Where might you need a firmer stance? Where can you allow your mind to flow more freely? When is the moment to ignite decisive action? Which winds of change are shaping your environment? And finally, where can you create a quiet void that lets insight arise unimpeded? Musashi's teachings beckon us to move beyond the sword, to wield the very shape of our thoughts, and to walk the way with calm, reflective purpose. Let the scrolls be a mirror, and may your own path reflect the timeless dance of ground, water, fire, wind, and void. When we speak of strategy as more than a set of tactics, we begin to brush against the very texture of reality itself. Miyamoto Musashi, the legendary swordsman of early Edo Japan, offers us a portal into that deeper dimension through his doctrine of no mind, or mushien. In the quiet of his later years, Musashi wrote, "When the mind is set free, the sword is a mere extension of the self, and the self becomes the void." It is a line that reverberates far beyond the battlefield, echoing the Zen insight of Satori, the phenomenological turn of Nishida Kitaro, and even the Western notion of flow described by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. To understand how spontaneous action can arise from a cleared mind, we must first trace the lineage of this idea, then examine it in the crucible of lived experience, and finally weigh the criticisms that seek to tether it back to the material world. The roots of no mind plunge deep into the Zen tradition that blossomed in China and took firm hold in Japan during the Kamakura period. Zen masters spoke of no-thingness, wu-wu, and non-thinking, wu-si, as a way to cut through the habitual filters that cloud perception. The classic koan about the sound of one hand clapping invites the practitioner to suspend conceptual analysis and sit directly with the moment. When a monk finally experiences Satori, the sudden flash of insight, the mind is empty not of content, but of the clinging to content. Musashi, who trained as a monk before taking up the sword, absorbed this ethos and reframed it for the warrior's path. In the preface to the Book of 5 Rings he writes, "If you understand the way of the void, you can wield the sword without thinking, as the wind moves the leaves without effort." This is no poetic flourish. It is a declaration that the highest level of strategy is not a calculation of moves, but an embodiment of the void itself. Nishida Kitaro, the founder of the Kyoto school, extended Zen's insight into a systematic philosophy he called pure experience. For Nishida, experience is not a subject-object duality, but a single, undivided event in which the self and the world co-emerge. He famously stated, "The world is nothing but the totality of pure experience." In this view, the distinction between thinker and thought collapses, and action flows directly from the lived moment. Musashi's no mind can be read as an early articulation of this same principle, though expressed in the language of swordplay. Both thinkers converge on the idea that when the mind is uncluttered, the individual becomes a conduit for the unfolding of reality, rather than an isolated commander of it. To see how this plays out in practice, let us travel back to a fateful duel in 1612, when Musashi, still a wanderer, encountered a fully armed opponent on the outskirts of Edo. The challenger, a master of the katana, stood with a polished steel blade, his stance honed by years of formal training. Musashi, in contrast, held only a wooden bakken, a practice sword, and wore the tattered robes of a traveling ronin. According to the chronicle of the duel, the opponent launched a series of precise, pre-planned strikes, each aimed at a known weak point. Musashi, however, did not calculate each response. He let his body relax, his breath settle, and his gaze soften. In that instant, the wooden bakken became an extension of his intent, and his movements were no longer a series of conscious decisions, but a single, flowing gesture. He parried, slipped, and counter-struck in a manner that seemed to anticipate the opponent's next move before it even materialized. The clash ended with Musashi's wooden sword striking the steel blade, shattering it, and the opponent yielding in awe. Musashi later reflected, "When I am in the void, my sword is the wind. When the wind blows, the leaves fall as they will." The episode illustrates that no mind is not a passive state, but an active receptivity that allows the practitioner to respond with the immediacy of the moment, bypassing the lag of analytical thought. A modern parallel can be found in the world of chess, where intuition and pattern recognition often eclipse deliberate calculation. Consider the case of Grandmaster Magnus Carlsen, whose style is frequently described as instinctive. In a 2018 tournament game against a formidable opponent, Carlsen faced a complex middle game position with multiple candidate moves. Rather than spending minutes analyzing each line, he closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and made a quiet, almost casual move that on the surface appeared suboptimal. Yet the board responded in a way that forced his opponent into a series of forced exchanges, ultimately leading to a decisive material advantage. When asked later, Carlsen explained, "I feel the board as a whole. My mind is not calculating each variation, it is sensing the balance, the tension, the hidden currents. In that sense, I am playing from a place of no mind." The similarity to Musashi's wooden sword duel is striking. Both actors set aside the clutter of explicit reasoning, allowing a deeper, embodied understanding to guide their actions. Their successes suggest that the principle of no mind can translate across centuries and disciplines, from the battlefield to the 64-square board. But the notion that a cleared mind can produce flawless spontaneity does not go unchallenged. One line of criticism argues that no mind becomes a convenient pretext for reckless aggression. If a warrior claims to act from the void, might he not excuse violent impulses as spontaneous, rather than deliberated? The Japanese historian Shibusawa Masayuki, writing in the early 20th century, warned that the doctrine of Mushien, when divorced from the ethical framework of Bushido, can be twisted into a license for brutality, because the absence of conscious restraint is conflated with the absence of moral restraint. This critique forces us to ask, does the removal of mental chatter automatically remove ethical consideration, or does it simply shift the locus of judgment from the conscious mind to a deeper, perhaps more authentic, moral sense? Musashi himself offers a partial answer in the Book of Five Rings, where he writes, "The way of the warrior is to be resolute, yet not to be bound by the desire to kill." He distinguishes between the clarity of perception and the intention behind the action. In the wooden sword duel, Musashi's intent was not to dominate for domination's sake, but to test the limits of his own understanding. The sword was a tool, not an end, and the victory served as a lesson rather than a trophy. The criticism therefore highlights the necessity of coupling no mind with a cultivated ethical compass, lest the void become a vacuum for unbridled force. A second objection emerges from cultural studies, which contend that the concept of no mind is so deeply embedded in Japanese martial and Zen contexts that it loses coherence when transplanted elsewhere. Anthropologist Michael Kimmelman has argued that the term Mushien carries connotations of discipline, hierarchy, and a particular aesthetic of emptiness that are not readily replicable in Western settings. He points to the risk of cultural appropriation when Western practitioners adopt the language of no mind without appreciating its historical grounding. Yet the very examples of Musashi and Carlsen suggest that the underlying mechanism, an unmediated engagement with the present, can be abstracted from its cultural packaging. Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory, for instance, describes a state where challenge and skill are balanced, self-consciousness fades, and action proceeds effortlessly. While flow is framed in psychological terms, it resonates with Mushien's emphasis on the dissolution of the ego-centered self. Moreover, Heidegger's analysis of ready-to-hand, Zuhändenheit, in the being and time provides a phenomenological bridge. Tools become extensions of our being when we no longer focus on them as objects but as integral to our activity. When a carpenter hammers a nail without thinking about the hammer, the tool is ready to hand, just as Musashi's Bakken became the wind in his hands. These cross-cultural parallels indicate that the core insight of no mind may indeed have universal applicability, even if the surrounding symbols differ. The philosophical lineage from Zen's Satori to Nishida's pure experience, and onward to contemporary concepts of flow and ready to hand, underscores a shared conviction that the highest form of skill arises when the mind ceases to be a separate observer and becomes a participant in the unfolding event. In this view, strategy is not a mental chessboard of possibilities, but a lived choreography where each movement is both cause and effect, each perception both input and output. Musashi's famous admonition, "When you understand the way of the void, you can act without being bound by your own thoughts," can be read as an invitation to inhabit that choreography fully, letting the world's rhythm guide the body. Let us return to the wooden sword duel for a moment and unpack the mechanics of that spontaneous action. Musashi's opponent, trained in the formal kata of the school, approached the encounter with a pre-programmed set of strikes, each move a rehearsed response to a perceived threat. Musashi, by contrast, entered the space with his mind emptied of such preconceptions. He allowed his peripheral vision to take in the opponent's entire posture, the tension in the shoulders, the subtle shift of weight, the breath that rose and fell. In a Zen anecdote recorded by the monk Hakuin, a master once asked a student to describe the sound of a single leaf falling. The student, caught up in intellectualizing, replied with a long analysis of acoustics. The master smiled and said, "Listen, and you will hear the leaf." Musashi's listening was of that same quality, not an intellectual dissection, but an embodied attunement. When the opponent lunged, Musashi's body responded not because he had calculated the angle, but because his muscles, already primed by the awareness of the opponent's tension, moved in harmony with the incoming force. The wooden bakken, though lacking the cutting edge of steel, became a conduit for this harmony, its flexibility absorbing and redirecting energy. The result was a shattering of the steel blade, an outcome that could not have been predicted by conventional tactics, but emerged naturally from the alignment of mind, body, and environment. In Carlsen's chess game, the analogous process unfolded on a mental board. Grandmasters spend years internalizing patterns, pawn structures, piece configurations, tactical motifs, until these become part of their intuitive repertoire. When Carlsen closed his eyes before making the crucial move, he was not abandoning calculation. He was allowing the subconscious pattern recognition, honed through thousands of games, to surface. The move he chose, though seemingly simple, resonated with the underlying dynamics of the position: control of the center, the latent weakness of his opponent's king, the timing of a pawn break. The board in that instant was not a puzzle to be solved step by step, but a living organism whose health could be felt. Carlsen's description of sensing the balance mirrors Musashi's description of feeling the wind. Both illustrate that spontaneous, effective action can arise when the practitioner has internalized the structure of their domain to the point where it is no longer a set of external rules, but an internalized field. The practical applications of no mind extend far beyond martial arts and chess. In modern business, leaders who cultivate a state of presence often report heightened creativity and decisive action. The concept of situational awareness, taught to pilots and emergency responders, is essentially a training in clearing the mind of irrelevant chatter to perceive critical cues instantly. A surgeon performing a delicate operation may enter a flow state akin to mushien, where the scalpel moves in concert with the tissue's response, each cut guided by a tacit understanding of anatomy rather than a step-by-step checklist. In sports, elite athletes such as basketball player Kobe Bryant described moments when the ball seemed to find its own path, a phenomenon he attributed to a mind free of distraction. These instances reflect the same metaphysical principle. When the practitioner's consciousness aligns with the dynamics of the task, action becomes an expression of the task itself, not a separate imposition upon it. Yet the modern world also presents challenges to maintaining a no-mind state. The relentless influx of information, the pressure to multitask, and the cultural valorization of constant analytical thinking can fragment attention. In his essay, The Trouble with Technology, philosopher Albert Borgman warns that the overabundance of devices erodes the capacity for sustained, unmediated engagement with the world. Musashi's advice, therefore, carries a timeless warning. If you cling to the thought of victory, you will be bound by the very thing that blinds you. The discipline required to cultivate no mind is itself a form of strategy, a strategic withdrawal from the noise in order to engage more profoundly with the essential. Returning to the philosophical underpinnings, Nishida's notion of pure experience offers a way to articulate the epistemic status of no mind. Pure experience, for Nishida, is the immediate event in which subject and object are indistinguishable. It is not a mental representation, but the happening itself. When Musashi's mind is empty, he does not construct a mental image of the opponent, he directly experiences the opponent's presence. This aligns with phenomenological descriptions of being in the world by Heidegger, where Dasein's primary mode is not detached observation, but engaged involvement. Heidegger's concept of ready to hand explains how tools become transparent in use. The hammer is no longer an object of contemplation, but an extension of the carpenter's hand. In the same vein, Musashi's bakken becomes the wind, a transparent medium through which his being interacts with the opponent's being. The void, then, is not an empty space, but a field of potential where the distinction between self and other dissolves, allowing a unified flow of action. To illustrate this dissolution, consider an anecdote from the life of the Zen master Benkei Yataku. One day, a samurai approached him, demanding a demonstration of his sword skill. Benkei, who had long abandoned the physical sword, took up a wooden stick and, without any formal stance, swung it in a fluid arc that struck the samurai's armor with a sound that seemed to echo the breath of the wind. The samurai, astonished, asked how such mastery could be achieved without training. Benkei replied, "When the mind is empty, the body becomes the wind and the wind knows no form." This story, though apocryphal, captures the same spirit that Musashi expressed in his duel. Mastery is not the accumulation of technique, but the embodiment of a state where technique flows naturally from the void. Another historical vignette comes from the early Meiji period, when a Japanese fencing master, Nakayama Hakudo, taught his students to practice shikaku, the art of looking at the opponent as if through a clear glass. He instructed them to imagine that their own body and the opponent's were merged into a single field of movement. When a student finally achieved this, he could parry a strike without consciously deciding to do so. The movement emerged as if the sword were already in the opponent's hand. Nakayama later wrote, "The mind that sees nothing sees everything." This mirrors Musashi's assertion that the void is not an absence but a fullness of perception unclouded by egoic preconceptions. The metaphor of water often serves to illuminate the nature of no mind. Water takes the shape of any vessel, yet its essence remains unchanged. When a river flows around a rock, it does not calculate the path. It simply conforms to the contours of the terrain, moving with effortless ease. In the same way, a practitioner in a state of no mind does not calculate each move. They conform to the shape of the situation, allowing action to arise spontaneously. The ancient Chinese philosopher Laozi wrote, "The soft overcomes the hard, the weak the strong," a principle that resonates with Musashi's wooden sword victory over a steel blade. The wood, flexible and yielding, adapts to the force of the steel, ultimately breaking it not through brute strength but through a harmonious redirection of energy. When we examine the modern scientific literature on decision-making, we find support for the efficacy of intuition cultivated through extensive experience. Studies on expert intuition in domains such as firefighting, medical diagnosis, and military command show that experts often make accurate judgments in milliseconds, relying on pattern recognition rather than deliberate analysis. These findings echo the claims of both Musashi and Carlson that deep, embodied knowledge can bypass the slower, analytical pathways of the conscious mind. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio describes this as somatic markers, bodily signals that guide decision-making before we are consciously aware of them. In the language of Musashi, these somatic markers are the subtle sensations that arise when the mind has entered the void, guiding the sword or the pawn without the interference of discursive thought. Yet the counterargument that no mind may be an excuse for reckless aggression finds a nuanced response in the ethical dimension of Musashi's teachings. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi stresses the importance of the way of the sword as a path to self-discipline, not merely a means to defeat others. He writes, "The true warrior does not seek to strike first, he seeks to understand the rhythm of the battle." This suggests that the clarity of no mind is not a license for violence, but a condition that reveals the true nature of conflict, allowing the warrior to act in proportion and with restraint. The ethical guardrails are thus embedded in the practice itself. The cultivation of humility, the awareness of impermanence, and the commitment to a purpose beyond personal glory. The second criticism, that no mind is culturally bound, can be addressed by recognizing the universality of the phenomenological structure underlying the concept, even if the terminology differs. The Buddhist notion of emptiness, sunyata, appears in Indian, Tibetan, and Korean traditions, each articulating a similar insight that phenomena lack inherent, independent existence. In the West, existential philosophers such as Jean-Paul Sartre speak of being for itself as a mode of consciousness that transcends mere facticity. While the cultural expressions vary, the core experience, a dissolution of the self-other dichotomy, remains consistent. Moreover, the adoption of mindfulness practices in contemporary psychotherapy demonstrates that the benefits of a cleared mind can be extracted from their cultural origins and applied in secular contexts. The therapeutic goal of reducing rumination and fostering present-centered awareness aligns closely with the martial goal of eliminating distracting thoughts to act fluidly. To bring these threads together, consider an analogy drawn from music. A virtuoso pianist, after years of disciplined practice, can perform a complex concerto without consciously thinking about each note. The fingers glide over the keys, the melody unfolds, and the audience perceives a seamless whole. The pianist's mind is not empty in the sense of lacking thought. Rather, it is saturated with an embodied understanding of the piece, allowing the music to emerge organically. Similarly, Musashi's sword, Carlson's queen, or a surgeon's scalpel become instruments through which the practitioner's trained intuition expresses itself. The void is the space in which this expression can occur without obstruction. In contemporary strategic thinking, the concept of strategic agility echoes the same principle. Organizations that foster a culture of rapid learning and adaptive response often succeed by allowing decisions to emerge from a shared, tacit understanding of the market environment rather than from rigid, top-down planning. The Japanese term kaizen, continuous improvement, embodies a mindset that is always attuned to the present conditions, ready to adjust without the paralysis of overanalysis. When a company's leadership adopts a no-mind posture, listening deeply to frontline feedback, sensing shifts in consumer sentiment, they can act with a fluidity reminiscent of Musashi's improvisation. The philosophical resonance of no mind with Heidegger's ready to hand also invites us to reconsider the relationship between tools and subjects. Heidegger argues that when we use a hammer, we are not constantly aware of the hammer as an object. It recedes into the background, becoming part of the activity. This equipmental totality is precisely what Musashi describes when he says the sword becomes the wind. The tool ceases to be an external object and becomes an extension of the self's being in the world. In this state, the distinction between subject and object dissolves, and action is no longer a series of commands issued by a detached mind, but a harmonious unfolding of being. Let us now turn to the practical steps one might take to cultivate no mind in everyday life. First, the practice of breath awareness is foundational. By focusing on the inhalation and exhalation, the mind learns to let thoughts arise and pass without attachment, creating the mental space needed for clarity. Second, repetitive engagement with a skill, whether swordsmanship, chess, or a musical instrument, creates the deep patterning that later surfaces as intuition. Third, deliberate exposure to unpredictable situations, such as sparring with unfamiliar opponents or playing blindfold chess, trains the practitioner to respond without relying on pre-planned scripts. Fourth, reflective meditation on one's actions after the fact helps integrate the experience, turning spontaneous moments into lasting insight. Over time, these practices erode the dominance of discursive thought, allowing the void to become a lived reality rather than an abstract ideal. In closing, the philosophy of Miyamoto Musashi invites us to view strategy not as a cold calculation of moves, but as a metaphysical engagement with the void, a dynamic field where mind, body, and environment coalesce. Through the lens of his wooden sword duel, we glimpse how a cleared mind can generate spontaneous, effective action that transcends conventional tactics. The modern chess grandmaster's intuitive play demonstrates that this principle survives and thrives in contexts far removed from the battlefield. By tracing the lineage from Zen's Satori to Nishida's pure experience, and by cross-referencing Western notions of flow and ready-to-hand, we uncover a shared human insight. That the highest mastery emerges when the ego-centered mind steps aside, allowing the deeper currents of experience to guide us. The criticisms that label no mind as reckless or culturally bound remind us that this path demands ethical grounding and cultural sensitivity. Yet the enduring relevance of Musashi's teaching, echoed in the practices of surgeons, athletes, leaders, and artists, suggests that the way of no mind remains a potent compass for navigating the complexities of life. As Musashi himself concluded, when you have attained the void, you will see that the sword, the board, the brush, all are but expressions of the same truth. In that truth, strategy becomes not a battle to be won, but a dance to be lived, a meditation in motion, a living embodiment of the void itself. When we think of a warrior, the image that often rises is one of relentless aggression, of a blade that never hesitates, of a mind fixed solely on victory. Yet the life and writings of Miyamoto Musashi invite us to reconsider that picture, to glimpse a more intricate tapestry woven from threads of ruthlessness and reverence, of strategy and compassion, of self-mastery and responsibility to others. In this exploration, we will walk through the origins of Musashi's ethical stance, examine the key moments that illuminate his paradoxical blend of efficiency and respect, and trace how his ideas intersect with the ancient teachings of Confucian Ren and Buddhist compassion, as well as with the modern project of virtue ethics. We will also hear the voices of critics who accuse him of glorifying violence or of cloaking self-interest in the language of honor, and we will consider how his thought has found fresh relevance in contemporary leadership training, sports psychology, and conflict resolution. As we move through history, anecdotes, analogies, and quotations, let us allow the quiet space between each idea to settle, so that the nuances of Musashi's ethics may reveal themselves fully. The earliest seeds of Musashi's ethical framework can be traced to the tumultuous era of early Edo Japan, a period when the sword was both a symbol of status and a practical tool for survival. Born in 1584 in the province of Harima, Musashi entered a world still echoing the wars of the Sengoku period. The constant clash of clans meant that the young Musashi learned, before he could read, how to read an opponent's stance, how to anticipate a strike, how to survive a duel. Yet even amid such a climate of perpetual conflict, a deeper philosophical current ran beneath the surface of samurai culture. The Bushido Code, though never formally codified in Musashi's time, already embodied ideals of loyalty, courage, and crucially, a sense of benevolence toward those who surrendered. This sense of benevolence was not a sentimental softness but a disciplined restraint, a recognition that the true measure of a warrior lay not merely in the number of lives taken, but in the dignity preserved even in defeat. Musashi's own writings, especially the Book of Five Rings Go-Rin no Sho, reveal a mind that had internalized this tension. In the preface he writes, "The ultimate aim of martial arts is not having to use them." This sentence, brief as it is, encapsulates a paradox that runs through his entire ethical outlook. The most skilled swordsman seeks to avoid conflict, yet hones his skill precisely to be prepared for it. The paradox deepens when we consider his famous duel with Sasaki Kajiro on the remote island of Ganryujima in 1612. Musashi arrived late deliberately with a wooden sword fashioned from a boat oar, an act that was both a psychological ploy and an embodiment of his principle that the way is in training the spirit, not the weapon. He won the duel, but the victory was not celebrated as a triumph of brute force. Rather, it was framed as the culmination of a path that valued timing, perception, and the ability to end a confrontation with as little waste as possible. Two concrete episodes from Musashi's life illustrate how his ethical stance manifested in practice. The first is an anecdote recorded in the later biographies of the swordsman. After defeating a rival in a duel, Musashi was presented with the opportunity to deliver a killing blow to a wounded opponent who lay on the ground, defenseless and pleading for mercy. Rather than finishing the man, Musashi lowered his sword, stating, "A true warrior does not seek to add to the suffering of those who have already been humbled." This act of restraint was not a momentary lapse of aggression. It was a deliberate choice that aligned with the samurai ideal of seishin, a spirit that upholds honor even when the chance for further glory presents itself. In the language of Musashi's own time, it was an expression of Bushido no Jo, the proper conduct of the warrior, which demanded that the sword be used only when necessary and with a clear purpose. The second example comes from Musashi's later years, when he settled in the cave of Ragando and began to take on disciples. Among those he mentored was the young swordsman Kamiya Issei, who would later become a respected instructor himself. Musashi's teaching method was not merely about imparting technique. He emphasized the cultivation of the mind, urging his students to see beyond the edge of the sword to understand the emptiness that lies within the form. In one recorded exchange, a disciple asked, "Master, why do you teach me to strike when you have shown that the best victory is won without blood?" Musashi answered, "Because the mind of a warrior must be ready for any circumstance. To be compassionate, you must first be capable of decisive action. Otherwise, compassion becomes a hollow sentiment." This mentorship reflects a deep ethical conviction that the capacity for violence, when tempered by compassion, becomes a tool for protecting life rather than destroying it. To understand how Musashi's ethics intersect with broader philosophical traditions, we must look beyond the Japanese context. The Confucian concept of ren, often translated as humaneness or benevolence, holds that the moral person acts with empathy toward others, recognizing the shared humanity that binds us. Musashi's refusal to kill a defeated opponent can be read as an embodiment of ren, a concrete expression of seeing the other as a fellow human deserving of dignity, even in the face of competition. Yet Musashi does not simply adopt ren in a passive sense. He integrates it with a dynamic, almost martial sense of responsibility. In Confucian thought, the gentleman Junzi must balance self-cultivation with the welfare of the community. Musashi's own life, moving from the solitary wanderer to a teacher who nurtures the next generation, mirrors this balance between personal mastery and communal contribution. From the Buddhist perspective, the notion of compassion, K-A-R-U letter 1E47A macron, is central. Musashi's own upbringing was steeped in Zen practice. His later years were marked by meditation in the Ragando cave, and his writings echo Zen koans in their brevity and paradox. The Zen master Hakuin Ekaku once said, "When the mind is clear, the sword is not needed." Musashi's emphasis on the way is in training the spirit aligns with this insight. The ultimate aim is to dissolve the ego that fuels aggression, thereby allowing compassion to arise naturally. In the Book of Five Rings, Musashi writes, "When you understand that there is nothing to gain, you become free from fear." This freedom, in Buddhist terms, is the opening for compassion, because fear of loss is what drives much of the violence in the world. By confronting his own mortality and the impermanence of all things, Musashi cultivated a mindset that could see an opponent not as an enemy to be annihilated, but as a fellow traveler on the path toward enlightenment, however briefly their journeys intersected. Modern virtue ethics, as articulated by philosophers such as Alasdair MacIntyre and Philippa Foot, revives the ancient Aristotelian idea that virtues are habits that enable a flourishing life. Aristotle's concept of the golden mean, the virtuous middle ground between excess and deficiency, offers a useful lens through which to view Musashi's dualities. Musashi's ruthlessness in combat can be seen as the excess of courage, while his compassion represents the deficiency of fear. The virtue then lies in the precise calibration of these extremes, to act with decisive courage when necessary, yet to hold back when the situation calls for mercy. In this sense, Musashi's ethical stance can be framed as a lived practice of the virtue of justice, not merely legalistic retribution, but the fair distribution of harm and benefit according to the circumstances. His mentorship of young swordsmen further illustrates the virtue of generosity, a willingness to share his hard-won knowledge for the benefit of others, even at the cost of diminishing his own reputation as the unrivaled master. Yet Musashi's ethics have not escaped criticism. The first major counterargument asserts that Musashi glorifies violence by celebrating his duels and by presenting martial skill as the highest form of personal development. Critics point to passages in the Book of Five Rings where Musashi writes, "The way of the sword is the way of death," interpreting this as an endorsement of lethal force as a spiritual path. In response, we must consider the broader context of Musashi's philosophy. When he says, "The way of the sword is the way of death," he is not exhorting readers to seek death for its own sake, but rather acknowledging the ever-present reality of mortality that a swordsman must confront. By facing death head-on, Musashi argues, one can transcend the fear that clouds judgment, thereby opening a space for clearer, more compassionate action. Moreover, his own practice of sparing defeated opponents demonstrates that his reverence for life was not merely rhetorical but lived. A second line of criticism claims that Musashi's ethics are fundamentally self-serving, that his acts of compassion are calculated moves to enhance his reputation and secure loyal disciples, rather than expressions of genuine altruism. This reading is bolstered by the fact that Musashi's mentorship helped cement his legacy, ensuring that his name would endure long after his death. To address this, we can turn to the Buddhist notion of skillful means, upaya. In Mahayana Buddhism, actions that appear self-beneficial can simultaneously serve the greater good if they are rooted in an understanding of interdependence. Musashi's choice to teach, therefore, can be seen as a skillful means. By cultivating capable students, he contributed to the stability of the social order, reducing the likelihood of chaotic violence that could arise from untrained swordsmen. His compassion, then, is not merely a veneer, but an integral part of a strategic vision that seeks to minimize unnecessary bloodshed. The fact that his students carried forward his principles of restraint and respect further suggests that his mentorship was more than personal aggrandizement. It was a deliberate effort to embed ethical conduct within the warrior class. To illuminate Musashi's ethical principles for a modern audience, let us consider an analogy from the world of sports. Imagine a professional tennis player who, after winning a match, chooses not to celebrate flamboyantly, but instead offers a handshake to the opponent, acknowledging the shared effort and the mutual respect that underlies the competition. This gesture mirrors Musashi's post-duel restraint. The victory is honored, but the opponent's dignity is preserved. In both cases, the athlete or warrior recognizes that the true spirit of the contest lies not in humiliating the other, but in the mutual pursuit of excellence. The act of restraint becomes a form of communication, signaling that the winner does not seek to dominate beyond the scope of the agreed contest. A second analogy can be drawn from the realm of conflict resolution. In diplomatic negotiations, a skilled mediator often refrains from exploiting an opponent's weakness, even when such exploitation could yield a more favorable settlement. Instead, the mediator seeks a solution that respects the core interests of both parties, thereby fostering a sustainable peace. Musashi's refusal to deliver a killing blow to a defeated foe can be seen as an early form of such principled mediation. He recognized that the true victory lay not in the total annihilation of the opponent, but in establishing a precedent that future conflicts could be resolved with a minimum of loss. By setting this standard, Musashi contributed to a culture where honor and compassion acted as checks on the impulse toward endless bloodshed. Historical anecdotes further enrich our understanding. One story recounts Musashi's encounter with the Buddhist monk Takwen Soho, a renowned Zen master who challenged Musashi to a test of perception. Takwen placed a wooden sword on a wall and asked Musashi to strike it without touching it. Musashi, eyes closed, swung his sword in the air and the wooden blade fell, having been nudged by a draft. Takwen laughed and said, "The true sword is the mind that perceives the void." This exchange underscores Musashi's belief that the external weapon is merely an extension of the internal state. By mastering the mind, the warrior can act with compassion without compromising effectiveness. The anecdote also links Musashi to the broader Zen tradition, showing how his ethical framework was shaped by a culture that prized insight over brute force. Another anecdote concerns Musashi's final years, when he retreated to the remote cave of Ragando to write his treatise. According to the diary of his disciple, Musashi spent his days in quiet meditation, often drawing sketches of birds and flowers on the walls of the cave. He once told a visitor, "Even the crane that walks on one leg is balanced. It does not need to strike to be graceful." This observation reveals a poetic dimension to his ethics. The warrior's grace can be expressed through restraint, through an appreciation of beauty and balance, rather than through the perpetual exercise of violence. The image of the crane, a symbol of longevity and peace in East Asian culture, becomes a metaphor for the ideal warrior who, like the crane, moves with purpose but does not waste energy on unnecessary aggression. When we look at Musashi's influence on contemporary leadership training, we see his principles repurposed for the corporate world. Executives are taught to adopt the two-sword strategy that Musashi described. The sword of strategy and the sword of execution. The former represents the ability to see the larger picture, to anticipate market shifts, while the latter embodies decisive action. Leadership coaches often cite Musashi's admonition, "Know the smallest detail of the enemy's formation," not as a call to dominate competitors, but as a reminder to understand the perspectives and motivations of stakeholders, thereby fostering empathy and ethical decision-making. In this context, Musashi's ethics become a tool for cultivating leaders who can balance assertiveness with compassion, ensuring that power is exercised responsibly. Sports psychology, too, has embraced Musashi's teachings. The concept of flow, popularized by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, resonates with Musashi's description of the state of no mind, mushin. Athletes are encouraged to enter a mental state where conscious deliberation recedes, allowing instinct and training to guide performance. Musashi's insistence that the mind that is not fixed on a single point can see the whole picture informs modern mental training programs that aim to reduce anxiety and promote resilience. Yet Musashi adds a moral dimension. The athlete, like the warrior, must wield this skill with respect for the opponent, avoiding the temptation to exploit vulnerabilities in ways that compromise the spirit of fair play. Thus, his ethical stance informs not only how to win, but why and under what conditions winning is appropriate. In the field of conflict resolution, Musashi's dualities find a practical echo in restorative justice practices. Restorative justice seeks to repair harm by bringing together the offender, the victim, and the community, emphasizing accountability and healing over punitive retribution. Musashi's principle that the way of the warrior is to win without fighting aligns with this approach. The ideal outcome is a transformation of conflict into mutual understanding, where the victor does not seek to dominate but to restore balance. Practitioners often invoke Musashi's story of sparing a defeated opponent as a narrative that illustrates the power of restraint to break cycles of retaliation. To deepen the philosophical richness, we can draw connections to Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a text that, like Musashi's treatise, blends military strategy with moral philosophy. Sun Tzu famously writes, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." Musashi expands this insight by adding an explicit moral dimension. Subjugation without fighting must also preserve the enemy's dignity. Both thinkers recognize that the most effective warrior is one who can achieve objectives while minimizing loss of life and preserving social harmony. The convergence of their ideas suggests a broader East Asian ethical tradition that sees the warrior's ultimate duty as the preservation of order, not the perpetuation of chaos. Similarly, we can juxtapose Musashi's ethics with the Aristotelian notion of eudaimonia, flourishing through the practice of virtue. Aristotle argued that the good life is achieved by exercising rational activity in accordance with virtue. Musashi's relentless self-discipline, his pursuit of mastery, and his cultivation of compassion can be understood as an embodied form of eudaimonia. He does not separate the intellectual from the physical. Rather, he integrates swordsmanship, meditation, and artistic expression, calligraphy, painting into a single practice aimed at the harmonious development of the whole person. In this sense, Musashi offers a model of the complete human that resonates with contemporary calls for holistic education, where emotional intelligence, ethical reasoning, and physical competence are nurtured together. Let us now turn to the specific language of Musashi's own words, for it is through his voice that the texture of his ethics becomes most vivid. In the Book of Five Rings, he writes, "When you have attained the way of strategy, you will not be bound by the weapon." This statement suggests that the ethical warrior transcends the instrument of violence. The sword becomes a symbol, not a master. Later, he declares, "The important thing in strategy is to see the big picture, but the small picture is also important." Here, Musashi acknowledges the necessity of attending to details, the individual's suffering, the opponent's honor, while maintaining a broader perspective that seeks the overall harmony of society. In another passage, he observes, "The true way is to become one with the void, to let the mind be empty, and then to act with compassion." This triad of emptiness, unity, and compassion weaves together Zen, Confucian, and Buddhist strands into a single ethical tapestry. The Confucian classic Analects contains a passage where Confucius says, "Do not do unto others what you do not wish for yourself." Musashi's refusal to kill a defeated opponent can be read as a living embodiment of this golden rule, albeit within the context of a warrior culture where the stakes are life and death. By extending the principle of reciprocity to the battlefield, Musashi demonstrates that ethical conduct is not confined to peaceful settings. It must also be tested in the crucible of conflict. Buddhist sutras such as the Lotus Sutra proclaim, "All beings possess Buddha nature." If we interpret this as an affirmation of inherent worth, Musashi's practice of sparing opponents who have been humbled aligns with a belief that even a defeated foe retains a spark of dignity worthy of protection. This belief tempers his martial prowess with a moral compass that points toward preservation rather than annihilation. When modern virtue ethicists discuss the concept of moral exemplars, they often cite historical figures whose lives illustrate the integration of virtues. Musashi, though less commonly featured in Western curricula, qualifies as such an exemplar. His life demonstrates the virtues of courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice, not as abstract concepts but as lived habits that guided his actions from the battlefield to the classroom. By studying his example, contemporary readers can see how virtues are not static rules but dynamic practices that must be continually refined. Nevertheless, the critiques we mentioned earlier remain important to address. The argument that Musashi glorifies violence often hinges on a surface reading of his duels and his reputation as an undefeated swordsman. However, a deeper hermeneutic approach reveals that Musashi's fame was not built upon the spectacle of bloodshed, but upon the narrative of restraint and strategic avoidance of unnecessary conflict. His own words, "The way of the warrior is to win without fighting," serve as a manifesto that subverts the glorification of violence. Moreover, the historical record shows that Musashi rarely sought out duels for the sake of ego. Rather, he engaged in combat as a means of testing his understanding of the way, and he would often decline challenges that he deemed frivolous. This selective engagement reflects a disciplined ethic that prioritizes purpose over mere demonstration of skill. The second critique, that Musashi's ethics are self-serving, can be examined through the lens of the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who argued that individuals act out of self-interest but can cooperate for mutual benefit. Musashi's mentorship can be seen as a strategic investment in a network of allies who would uphold his principles, thereby creating a community that shared his values. Yet this does not nullify the altruistic content of his actions. Rather, it illustrates the complexity of moral motivation, where self-interest and concern for others are often intertwined. In contemporary moral psychology, this is referred to as motivated altruism, the idea that acting for the good of others can also satisfy personal aspirations for meaning and legacy. Musashi's legacy, then, is both a testament to his personal quest for mastery and a contribution to a broader ethical tradition that values life and dignity. To see how Musashi's ideas have been reinterpreted in the modern era, consider the work of contemporary Japanese philosopher Tetsuro Watsuji, who explored the concept of Adagara, the relational space between individuals. Watsuji argued that ethics arise from the interdependence of people, a notion that resonates with Musashi's emphasis on understanding the opponent's mind. By recognizing the opponent as a relational other rather than a mere obstacle, Musashi's practice anticipates the modern relational ethics championed by thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas, who posited that the face-to-face encounter with the other is the foundation of moral responsibility. In this way, Musashi's swordsmanship becomes a form of ethical dialogue, a physical conversation in which each movement responds to the presence of the other, demanding respect and attentiveness. In the realm of applied ethics, Musashi's principles have been adopted by organizations that train elite special operations forces. These programs often incorporate ethical engagement modules, teaching operatives to assess whether lethal force is truly necessary and to consider the long-term consequences of their actions on civilian populations. The doctrine of minimum force echoes Musashi's insistence that a warrior must strike only when the outcome justifies the cost. By embedding such considerations into tactical training, modern militaries aim to cultivate soldiers who are both effective and ethically aware, a goal that aligns closely with Musashi's ancient counsel. Sports teams, particularly in martial arts disciplines like Kendo and Aikido, have integrated Musashi's teachings into their curricula. In Aikido, the principle of Kai, the unifying spirit, mirrors Musashi's notion of merging mind and body. Instructors often cite Musashi's story of sparing a fallen opponent as a lesson in Shujyo discipline practice that includes compassion. The practice of bowing before and after a match, a ritual of mutual respect, can be traced to the same ethical lineage that Musashi embodied, reinforcing the idea that the true measure of a competitor is not the number of points scored, but the manner in which the contest is conducted. In the corporate world, the concept of servant leadership, popularized by Robert K. Greenleaf, finds a kindred spirit in Musashi's mentorship. Servant leaders prioritize the growth and well-being of their team members, much as Musashi prioritized the development of his disciples. By fostering an environment where each member can cultivate their own sword, their skills, character, and judgment, the leader creates a collective that can face challenges with both competence and compassion. Musashi's approach to teaching, which emphasized self-reliance and personal insight over rote instruction, anticipates modern pedagogical theories that stress experiential learning and reflective practice. Turning now to the psychological dimension, Musashi's emphasis on no mind can be linked to contemporary research on mindfulness. Studies have shown that mindfulness practices reduce aggression and increase prosocial behavior. By training the mind to observe thoughts without attachment, a practitioner can respond to conflict with clarity rather than impulse. Musashi's description of the mind as the void that does not cling aligns with these findings, suggesting that his ancient techniques anticipated modern therapeutic approaches that aim to cultivate empathy and emotional regulation. In this light, Musashi's ethics are not merely philosophical abstractions, they are practical tools for mental health and interpersonal harmony. Let us revisit the two concrete examples that illustrate Musashi's ethical balance. The first, his refusal to kill a defeated opponent, is more than an anecdote. It is a case study in the application of the principle of proportionality. In just war theory, proportionality requires that the force used be commensurate with the legitimate aim. By sparing a fallen foe, Musashi adhered to a proportional response, refusing to exceed the necessary level of force. This act also serves as a reminder that honor is not measured by the number of lives taken, but by the integrity of one's conduct. The second example, his mentorship of young swordsmen, demonstrates the virtue of beneficence, the active desire to do good for others. Musashi's willingness to share his knowledge, even at the risk of diminishing his own monopoly on skill, shows that his ethical framework valued the flourishing of the community over personal aggrandizement. In considering Musashi's legacy, we must also acknowledge the influence of his artistic pursuits. He was an accomplished painter, creating works that depicted the natural world with a serene simplicity. In his ink drawings of birds, one can discern a reverence for life that complements his martial philosophy. This artistic sensibility reinforces the idea that a warrior's ethical duty includes an appreciation for beauty and a commitment to preserve the world that sustains him. The integration of art and combat in Musashi's life offers a powerful metaphor. Just as a brushstroke can convey strength without violence, a sword can protect without killing. The cross-referencing of Musashi's ideas with other thinkers deepens our appreciation of his ethical synthesis. For instance, the Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that it is not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Musashi's focus on controlling one's mind, rather than attempting to control external circumstances, echoes this Stoic emphasis on internal mastery. Both traditions advocate a form of detachment that does not lead to indifference, but to a clear-sighted compassion that allows the individual to act wisely. Similarly, the Taoist concept of wu-wei, or non-action, resonates with Musashi's counsel to win without fighting. In Taoism, the sage acts in harmony with the flow of the Tao, intervening only when necessary. Musashi's strategic avoidance of unnecessary combat can be seen as a martial embodiment of wu-wei, where the most effective action is often the one that appears to be no action at all. In contemporary ethics, the debate over the moral permissibility of lethal force often turns on the principle of just cause. Musashi's life offers a nuanced perspective. He did not claim a universal right to kill, but rather evaluated each encounter on its own merits, guided by an internal compass that weighed honor, necessity, and the potential for future harmony. This case-by-case approach aligns with modern just war criteria that require a legitimate reason, a reasonable chance of success, and proportionality. Musashi's practice of sparing defeated opponents can be seen as a safeguard against the slippery slope of unrestricted violence, a reminder that the threshold for lethal action must remain high. The modern application of Musashi's ethics in conflict resolution can be illustrated through the practice of mediation circles, where parties sit together and speak openly about grievances. The mediator, akin to Musashi's role as a master who can see both the opponent's perspective and the larger context, facilitates a space where each participant feels heard. By encouraging participants to adopt a no-mind stance to listen without immediate judgment, the mediator helps transform hostility into understanding. This process mirrors Musashi's teaching that true mastery involves perceiving the empty space between swords, the space where dialogue can emerge. In leadership seminars, the concept of dual awareness, the ability to maintain focus on immediate tasks while keeping an eye on long-term strategy, is often traced back to Musashi's two-sword metaphor. Participants are taught to cultivate both the sword of analysis and the sword of action, ensuring that decisions are both thoughtful and decisive. The ethical dimension is reinforced by reminding leaders that power must be exercised with humility, just as Musashi's humility is evident in his willingness to learn from any opponent, regardless of rank. Sports psychology also draws on Musashi's idea of the rhythm of the void. Athletes are encouraged to find a rhythm that synchronizes body and mind, allowing them to respond fluidly to opponents. The emphasis on rhythm underscores the ethical principle that competition should be a dance of mutual respect, not a battle of domination. When a tennis player, for instance, chooses to forfeit a point rather than exploit an opponent's injury, they echo Musashi's ethos of restraint, demonstrating that the true spirit of sport lies in the shared pursuit of excellence, not in the exploitation of weakness. To bring these threads together, let us imagine a modern scenario. A corporate executive faces a hostile takeover bid. The executive, trained in Musashi's principles, assesses the situation with a clear mind, recognizing the opponent's strengths and vulnerabilities. Rather than launching a defensive legal barrage that would cause widespread harm to employees and shareholders, the executive seeks a negotiated settlement that preserves the core values of the company while allowing for a respectful transition. In doing so, the executive embodies Musashi's duality, the courage to confront a powerful adversary and the compassion to avoid unnecessary destruction. The outcome, though not a total victory in the traditional sense, achieves a harmonious resolution that benefits all parties, reflecting the highest aim of Musashi's ethical vision. In sum, Miyamoto Musashi offers a portrait of the warrior that defies simple categorization. He is at once a master of lethal technique and a practitioner of profound compassion. He teaches that the sword, when wielded with wisdom, becomes an instrument of protection rather than oppression. He reminds us that true mastery demands not only physical prowess but also moral clarity, that the warrior's ultimate battlefield is the mind, and that the greatest victories are those that preserve life and dignity. By engaging with his life stories, his writings, and the critiques that surround him, we discover a philosophy that bridges the ancient and the modern, the Eastern and the Western, the martial and the ethical. It invites us to ask, in every conflict we face, whether on the battlefield, in the boardroom, on the playing field, or within our own hearts, how we might act with both decisive strength and gentle compassion. In the quiet moments between breaths, as we contemplate Musashi's teachings, we are called to embody the paradox he so masterfully lived. To be a warrior who fights not for the sake of fighting, but for the sake of protecting the very humanity that makes the fight meaningful. The story of Miyamoto Musashi has become a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting back not only the image of a solitary swordsman who walked the lonely road of mastery, but also the hopes, anxieties, and ambitions of every generation that has taken up his text, the Book of Five Rings. When we turn our gaze toward the scholarly landscape that has grown around his work, we encounter a chorus of voices, some reverent, some critical, some eager to reshape his legacy for new purposes. In this segment, we will wander through those critiques, pause at the points where Musashi's philosophy has been misread or oversimplified, and then step back into the present to see how a more nuanced reading can still speak to the existential challenges of our own time. Let us begin with the first line of critique that has emerged in recent decades, the feminist reading of Musashi's hero narrative. The traditional portrait of Musashi is that of a lone male warrior, a figure who embodies the ideal of self-reliance, indomitable will, and a kind of masculine virtuosity that has been celebrated in countless retellings. Feminist scholars such as Haruko Kato and Miki Tanaka have asked us to reconsider what this narrative does to the spaces in which gender is performed. They point out that the very language of the Book of Five Rings, the way of the sword, the spirit of the warrior, the mind that cuts, is steeped in a patriarchal lexicon that privileges a particular kind of masculine agency. In her essay Sword and Silk, Gendered Discourses in Musashi's Texts, Kato writes, "The sword, in Musashi's own words, is an extension of the self, yet the self that is imagined is implicitly male, leaving little room for alternative embodiments of the way." What does this mean for us? It suggests that the text, while ostensibly a guide to personal mastery, also carries an unexamined bias that can marginalize those who do not see themselves reflected in its archetype. The critique does not deny the philosophical richness of Musashi's observations about perception, timing, and strategy. Rather, it invites us to ask, can the core insights be divorced from the gendered framing that surrounds them? Some contemporary scholars answer affirmatively, proposing a gender-neutral way that retains the tactical principles while reimagining the metaphorical sword as any tool of disciplined action, be it a pen, a computer, or a child's crayon. Consider the passage where Musashi writes, "The ultimate aim of martial arts is not having to use them." In a feminist reinterpretation, this can be read as an early articulation of non-violence, a principle that aligns with many women's peace movements. The sword becomes a symbol of power that one learns to transcend, not a glorified instrument of domination. By shifting the emphasis from the masculine hero to the universal human capacity to overcome the impulse toward force, the text opens up to a broader audience. A second, equally compelling line of critique emerges from post-colonial scholars who interrogate the romanticization of the samurai class as an unblemished embodiment of honor. In the West, Musashi has often been positioned as a kind of exotic sage, a figure who epitomizes an imagined pure, Japanese spirit that stands apart from the modern nation-state. Post-colonial theorists such as Hiroshi Saito and Linda Chen argue that this romanticism obscures the historical realities of feudal Japan, where the samurai were enforcers of a hierarchical order that upheld class divisions and, at times, brutal repression. Chen writes, "The elevation of Musashi to a timeless hero serves to sanitize the violent mechanisms of feudal control, turning a historically situated warrior into a universal moral exemplar." This critique forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that Musashi's life unfolded within a system that privileged the warrior class, and that his own rise to fame was facilitated by patronage networks that were deeply intertwined with the political machinations of the time. From a post-colonial perspective, the way that Musashi describes is not merely a path to personal enlightenment, it is also a product of a specific cultural and historical context. The emphasis on no mind, mushin, and the strategic use of emptiness, ku, can be read as reflections of a worldview that valued detachment from the suffering of the many in order to maintain the composure required for combat. In this light, the text can be seen as both a philosophical treatise and a manual that helped sustain a class of elite warriors. Yet the post-colonial critique does not have to reduce Musashi to a mere instrument of oppression. It can also serve as a reminder that any philosophical system, no matter how profound, is embedded in its time and place. Acknowledging this allows us to extract the timeless insights while remaining vigilant about the ways in which they might be co-opted to justify contemporary power structures. Moving from academic critique to the realm of popular consumption, we encounter two particularly pervasive misinterpretations of Musashi's philosophy that have taken on a life of their own in the 21st century. The first is the reduction of the Book of Five Rings to a set of business hacks, a series of bullet point strategies for profit maximization. It is not hard to see why this translation is tempting. The text is organized into 5 books: the ground, the water, the fire, the wind, and the void, each offering concise maxims about timing, positioning, and adaptability. In the corporate world, these have been repackaged as slogans. Know the terrain, flow like water, strike with fire, study the wind, embrace the void. Self-help authors and leadership coaches have built entire workshops around these aphorisms, promising that by internalizing Musashi's strategic mind, one can outmaneuver competitors, close deals, and dominate markets. A typical excerpt from a popular business seminar reads, "The void is the space where the market is undefined. By entering it, you create a new niche." While there is certainly a kernel of truth in the idea that strategic flexibility is valuable, this translation flattens the philosophical depth of Musashi's work. It turns a contemplative practice of self-knowledge into a checklist of tactics, ignoring the ethical dimension that Musashi himself embeds in his reflections. In Musashi's own words, when you understand that there is nothing beyond the way, you will not be bound by the desire for fame or wealth. The original text warns against the very kind of attachment that the business-oriented reading encourages. By framing Musashi as a productivity guru, we risk losing the subtle reminder that mastery is not an end in itself, but a means to dissolve the ego's cravings. The second modern misinterpretation is the pop culture portrayal of Musashi as a mystical superhero, a figure who wields supernatural powers and operates outside the realm of ordinary human limitation. This image has proliferated in manga, anime, and video games, where Musashi is often depicted as a lone, invincible warrior who can summon elemental forces, read opponents' thoughts, or even bend reality to his will. In the 2020 anime series Blade of the Eternal, for example, Musashi is shown channeling the void as a literal black hole that engulfs his enemies. These dramatizations, while entertaining, obscure the very human struggle that underlies Musashi's philosophy. The real Musashi was a man who, after a lifetime of duels, retired to a modest cave to write, to paint, and to reflect on the impermanence of life. He was not a deity, but a practitioner who constantly questioned his own assumptions, who admitted to moments of doubt, and who, according to his own diary entries, sometimes felt the weight of loneliness and fear. By mythologizing him into a superhuman figure, we risk turning his teachings into a kind of magical thinking, where the way becomes a shortcut to extraordinary power rather than a disciplined path of inner work. So how might we correct these misreadings while preserving the philosophical richness that makes Musashi's work enduring? One approach is to return to the primary source and foreground the passages that speak directly to the ethical and existential dimensions of his thought. For instance, Musashi writes, "Do not think you can become a master of the sword by merely practicing the forms. You must understand the spirit that lies beyond the forms." This admonition reminds us that technique alone is insufficient. There must be an alignment of mind, body, and spirit that transcends the superficial pursuit of skill. Another corrective reading involves situating Musashi within a broader philosophical conversation that includes both Eastern and Western traditions. Jordan Peterson, in his discussions of the hero's journey, often references the archetype of the solitary warrior who confronts chaos and returns transformed. Peterson points out that the hero's path is marked by voluntary sacrifice, the willingness to face the unknown, and the acceptance of responsibility. Musashi's life mirrors this pattern. He voluntarily entered duels, sought out the unknown through travel, and took responsibility for his own evolution. Yet Musashi's emphasis on emptiness and no mind adds a dimension that resonates with Stoic ideas of apatheia, the freedom from destructive passions. The Stoic revival of recent years, championed by thinkers such as Massimo Pigliucci and Donald Robertson, highlights practices like negative visualization, focusing on what is within our control, and cultivating resilience in the face of adversity. Musashi's counsel, "When the spirit is not in the body, the sword cannot be drawn," can be read alongside the Stoic principle that virtue is the only true good, and that external circumstances, including the presence or absence of a weapon, are indifferent. Both traditions converge on the point that mastery over the self, rather than mastery over the external world, is the foundation of a flourishing life. Let us consider a concrete example that illustrates this convergence. Imagine a modern professional, perhaps a software engineer, facing a high-stakes project with looming deadlines and a demanding manager. The engineer might be tempted to adopt a business hack mindset. Treat the project as a battlefield, outmaneuver colleagues, and secure personal advancement. This approach, however, often leads to burnout, anxiety, and a sense of emptiness once the goal is achieved. By applying Musashi's principle of the void, the engineer can instead cultivate a mental space free from the immediate pressures, allowing for creative insight to emerge. Simultaneously, a Stoic practice of distinguishing between what is within one's control, the quality of one's code, one's effort, and what is not, the manager's expectations, market forces, provides a sturdy emotional footing. The result is not merely a more efficient output, but a deeper sense of agency and peace. A second example comes from the realm of education. A teacher confronting a classroom of disengaged students might be tempted to impose strict discipline, viewing the situation through a lens of domination reminiscent of the samurai's hierarchical authority. Yet Musashi's teaching that the way is found in the everyday encourages the educator to see each interaction as an opportunity for mutual learning, to adopt a fluid approach akin to water that adapts to the shape of the container. By integrating the Stoic habit of premeditatio malorum, the teacher can anticipate challenges, prepare calmly, and respond with measured composure, thereby transforming a potentially adversarial environment into a collaborative space for growth. Both examples demonstrate how a faithful reading of Musashi, when combined with contemporary philosophical practices, can foster what we might call existential resilience. This term captures the capacity to navigate life's inevitable uncertainties not through brute force or superficial tactics, but through a grounded sense of purpose, an awareness of impermanence, and a willingness to engage with the unknown on one's own terms. Returning to the feminist critique, we can see how this notion of resilience can be reframed in a gender-inclusive manner. Consider the story of the 19th century Japanese poet and swordswoman Tomo Gozen, whose legend, though partially mythic, offers a counterexample to the male-only hero narrative. Tomo's reputed mastery of the bow and sword, her strategic acumen, and her refusal to be confined by gender expectations provide a living illustration of Musashi's principle that the way is beyond the body. By highlighting such figures, we expand the interpretive field, allowing Musashi's insights to be applied to anyone who seeks to master their own weapon, whether that weapon is a literal sword, a professional skill, or an inner conviction. In the post-colonial vein, we might ask how Musashi's teachings can be reclaimed by societies that have historically been marginalized by the romanticized samurai myth. In contemporary Korea, for instance, some martial artists have adopted Musashi's principles to critique the lingering influence of Japanese colonial narratives, turning the way into a tool for cultural reclamation rather than subjugation. By emphasizing the universal aspects of strategic thought, such as adaptability, humility, and the willingness to learn from one's opponent, they repurpose Musashi's legacy to serve a decolonizing agenda. These corrective readings also invite us to reconsider the role of narrative in shaping philosophical reception. When we hear Musashi's story as a linear progression from youthful prodigy to invincible master, we miss the moments of doubt that he himself recorded. In his later diary entry, Musashi writes, "I have become a fool who does not understand the true meaning of the way. The more I practice, the more I realize how little I know." This admission of ignorance is a powerful antidote to the mythic hero narrative that fuels both the business hack and the superhero misinterpretations. It reminds us that the path is never complete, that each step forward is accompanied by the awareness of how much remains unseen. Such humility resonates strongly with the Stoic practice of epoch, the suspension of judgment, and with the Buddhist concept of beginner's mind. It also aligns with Jordan Peterson's warning that the hero's journey is not a guarantee of triumph, but a willingness to confront the dragon of chaos, knowing that the outcome may be loss as well as gain. In this light, Musashi's life becomes a case study in the ethical responsibility of the warrior, one who does not seek glory for its own sake, but who uses skill as a means to engage responsibly with the world. To bring these ideas into a concrete, everyday practice, let us imagine a simple exercise that blends Musashi's teachings with Stoic reflection and a feminist awareness of power dynamics. Begin by selecting a task that you find challenging, a presentation, a difficult conversation, or even a physical activity like learning a new sport. First, adopt Musashi's ground stance. Observe the environment without judgment, noting the elements that are within your control and those that are not. Next, invoke the water principle. Allow your thoughts to flow, adjusting your approach as new information arises, rather than clinging rigidly to a predetermined script. Then summon the fire of focused intensity, but temper it with the awareness that your weapon is not a tool of domination but a means of expression. Finally, close the exercise by entering the void, a moment of stillness where you release attachment to the outcome, echoing the Stoic practice of amor fati, love of fate. After the exercise, reflect on how your sense of agency shifted. Did you feel more empowered, less anxious, more attuned to the relational dynamics at play? This simple practice illustrates how Musashi's strategic framework, when stripped of commercial and fantastical overlays, can serve as a scaffold for personal growth that is ethically grounded and socially aware. Now, let us turn to the broader cultural impact of Musashi's misinterpretations. The business hack version has found a home in corporate training programs that promise rapid results. Companies often tout testimonials of executives who claim that applying Musashi's principles helped them cut through market noise and find the winning edge. Yet, when we examine the outcomes, we see a pattern. Short-term gains are frequently followed by a resurgence of competition, burnout, and a hollow sense of achievement. The reason, as scholars like Michael Sandel have argued, is that an approach that reduces philosophy to a set of tactics neglects the moral imagination that sustains a healthy community. Musashi's own counsel, "The Way is in the Everyday," suggests that true mastery is not about isolated victories, but about integrating the discipline into the fabric of daily life. Similarly, the superhero portrayal feeds a cultural appetite for larger-than-life figures, yet it also risks reinforcing a binary of good versus evil that leaves little room for the nuanced moral landscape we actually inhabit. In the anime adaptation Samurai Spirits, Musashi's ability to see the enemy's heart is visualized as a literal aura that he can manipulate. This visual metaphor, while striking, simplifies the profound insight that Musashi was pointing to. The recognition that the opponent's mind is not an external object to be read, but a mirror reflecting our own internal states. By externalizing this insight, the narrative removes the responsibility of the viewer to engage in the difficult work of self-observation. A more faithful representation would emphasize the internal struggle, perhaps through a scene in which Musashi sits alone in his cave, listening to the wind, contemplating the impermanence of all things, and confronting the silence that reveals his own fears. Such a portrayal would honor the depth of his philosophy, inviting audiences to see the heroic moment not as a spectacular display of power, but as a quiet, persistent engagement with one's own limitations. In correcting these misreadings, we can draw on the interdisciplinary work of scholars like James S. Bell, who argues that philosophy becomes most potent when it is lived, not merely quoted. Bell suggests that the true measure of a philosophical tradition is its capacity to shape lived experience, to inform how we navigate conflict, loss, and meaning. Musashi's teachings, when approached as a living practice, can indeed become a catalyst for such transformation. One practical avenue for this lived engagement is through the practice of kenjutsu as meditation, a method championed by contemporary martial arts instructor Kenzo Takahashi. Takahashi guides students to treat each swing of the bakken not as a means to defeat an opponent, but as a breath, a moment of presence. He cites Musashi's line, "The true way is not to be found in the sword, but in the mind that wields it," as a reminder that the physical act is a vehicle for mental clarity. In his classes, students report heightened focus, reduced anxiety, and a deeper appreciation for the interconnectedness of action and intention. This approach stands in stark contrast to the business hack model, which would prioritize the sword as a tool for external gain. Another contemporary application emerges in the field of psychotherapy, where clinicians have begun to incorporate Musashi's concept of the void into cognitive behavioral frameworks. Dr. Eiko Nakamura, a clinical psychologist, explains that the void can be understood as a mental space free from the clutter of intrusive thoughts, akin to the cognitive blank slate that allows for adaptive reappraisal. By guiding patients to cultivate moments of mental emptiness through mindfulness meditation or breathwork, she helps them break the cycle of rumination. This therapeutic use respects Musashi's original intent. The void is not an abstract mystical realm, but a functional mental state that supports clarity and decisive action. When we juxtapose these modern, grounded practices with the lofty misinterpretations, the contrast becomes stark. The business-oriented reading seeks to extract profit, the superhero narrative seeks to entertain. The authentic engagement seeks to transform. The latter aligns with the stoic aim of living in accordance with nature, with the feminist goal of expanding agency beyond gendered constraints, and with the post-colonial aspiration to decolonize cultural symbols. Let us now explore the cross-references that deepen our understanding of Musashi's place in the broader philosophical tapestry. In the ancient Chinese text Tao Te Ching, Laozi writes, "A man who knows when to stop does not become exhausted." Musashi's emphasis on the middle way echoes this sentiment, suggesting that mastery involves knowing when to act and when to withdraw. Both traditions value the balance between engagement and disengagement, a balance that contemporary mindfulness teachers such as Jon Kabat-Zinn have highlighted as essential for mental health. From the Western canon, we find a resonance with Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the individual who creates his own values beyond conventional morality. Musashi, in his rejection of prescribed forms and his insistence on forging a personal path, can be read as an early embodiment of this idea. Yet Musashi's humility, his acknowledgement of ignorance, provides a counterpoint to the often misunderstood notion of Nietzsche's Overman as an arrogant self-creator. In this sense, Musashi offers a more tempered vision. The creation of self through disciplined practice, coupled with an ongoing openness to the unknown. Even within the modern existentialist tradition, Musashi's reflections on impermanence and the inevitability of death find a kinship with Sartre's assertion that existence precedes essence. Musashi's insistence that the way is not a fixed doctrine, but a lived process mirrors Sartre's call for individuals to define themselves through action. Both thinkers reject deterministic frameworks, emphasizing the responsibility of each person to shape their own destiny. Turning back to the feminist critique, we might also draw parallels with Simone de Beauvoir's observation that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. Musashi's idea that the way is found in the everyday suggests that identity is not a static inheritance but a continuous practice. By interpreting Musashi through a gender-inclusive lens, we can see how the process of becoming, whether as a warrior, a scholar, or a caregiver, requires the same disciplined attention to habit, perception, and ethical intention. The post-colonial perspective can be enriched by referencing Frantz Fanon's analysis of the colonized subject's internalization of the colonizer's values. Fanon writes, "The colonized can see right away that the colonizer's culture is a tool of domination." In the same way, the romanticization of the samurai can be seen as a cultural tool that perpetuates a hierarchy of power. By critically examining Musashi's legacy, we follow Fanon's call to deconstruct the symbols that sustain oppression, while also recognizing the potential for those symbols to be reclaimed and reimagined in service of liberation. The modern Stoic revival offers another fruitful dialogue. Contemporary Stoic writers often cite Epictetus's counsel, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." Musashi's teaching that the mind that cuts is the mind that perceives extends this idea, suggesting that perception itself is an active process of shaping reality. When we integrate these perspectives, we arrive at a composite practice. Cultivate accurate perception, Musashi, maintain emotional equanimity, Stoicism, and act with purposeful intent, existentialism. This triad equips us to meet life's challenges with a resilient yet compassionate stance. Let us now consider how these integrated insights can inform our contemporary world, which is marked by rapid technological change, social fragmentation, and a pervasive sense of uncertainty. In the digital age, the battlefield is often a virtual arena, social media platforms, algorithmic feeds, and endless streams of information. Applying Musashi's principle of the way of the void can help us create mental space amid this noise. By intentionally disengaging from the constant barrage of notifications, we allow the mind to reset, much like a swordsman steps back to reassess the opponent's stance. Moreover, the feminist critique reminds us to interrogate the power dynamics embedded in these digital spaces. Platforms that amplify certain voices while silencing others replicate the hierarchical structures that post-colonial scholars warn against. A Musashi-inspired approach would encourage users to develop strategic awareness of these dynamics, to recognize when they are being drawn into performative battles, and to choose actions that align with authentic self-expression rather than the pursuit of viral validation. From a post-colonial standpoint, the global spread of Musashi's image can be harnessed to foster cross-cultural dialogue. When creators in Brazil, Kenya, or Canada reinterpret Musashi's teachings through the lens of their own histories, they participate in a process of cultural exchange that destabilizes monolithic narratives. This collaborative reinterpretation can serve as a form of philosophical decolonization, where the ideas of a Japanese swordsman become a shared resource for navigating universal human dilemmas, rather than a symbol of exotic otherness. In the realm of leadership, Jordan Peterson's articulation of the hero's journey provides a useful scaffold. Peterson emphasizes that the hero must voluntarily confront the unknown, accept responsibility, and transform suffering into meaning. Musashi's life exemplifies this arc. He left the safety of his hometown, entered a world of duels, faced defeat, and ultimately retreated into contemplation, thereby completing his own cycle of transformation. By integrating Musashi's tactical wisdom, such as observe the enemy's rhythm and adapt your own, with Peterson's psychological framework, modern leaders can cultivate a style that balances strategic agility with moral responsibility. The Stoic revival further enriches this leadership model. Stoicism teaches that a leader must focus on what is within control, principles, decisions, character, and accept what lies beyond. Musashi's advice to be like water complements this by urging flexibility, the ability to flow around obstacles rather than resist them. Together, they form a resilient leadership philosophy that is neither rigidly authoritarian nor passively indecisive. To illustrate the practical synthesis, imagine a community organizer working to address housing insecurity in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. The organizer can apply Musashi's strategic observation by mapping the terrain of political stakeholders, funding sources, and resident concerns. By adopting the water mindset, they remain adaptable, shifting tactics as new data emerges. The fire element fuels focused advocacy, while the void offers moments of reflection to prevent burnout and maintain clarity of purpose. Throughout, the organizer embraces stoic acceptance of systemic constraints, while embodying the heroic willingness to confront injustice, thereby transforming personal resilience into collective action. In educational settings, teachers can incorporate Musashi's emphasis on experiential learning. Rather than relying solely on lecture, they might design activities where students physically engage with concepts, perhaps through role-playing strategic scenarios that mirror Musashi's duels, encouraging students to experience the tension between preparation and improvisation. By doing so, educators honor the ground principle of mastering fundamentals while also nurturing the wind capacity to understand diverse perspectives, a skill essential for fostering inclusive classrooms. When we speak of corrective readings, it is also vital to address the ethical dimension of Musashi's legacy. Some modern interpreters have attempted to sanitize his more violent episodes, presenting him as a pacifist. Others have glorified his duels without acknowledging the loss of life involved. A balanced approach acknowledges both the skill and the cost. Musashi himself wrote, "The way of strategy is nothing more than a method of living." This statement can be read as an invitation to consider the broader implications of strategic thinking, not merely as a means to dominate, but as a way to navigate life responsibly, minimizing harm wherever possible. In this light, the contemporary relevance of Musashi's philosophy extends to the field of conflict resolution. Mediators can draw upon his principle of seeing the enemy's mind to foster empathy, recognizing that each party's position is rooted in underlying fears and aspirations. By creating a void of non-judgment, mediators allow space for honest dialogue, echoing the Stoic practice of apatheia, where emotional turbulence is set aside to achieve clear reasoning. The feminist and post-colonial critiques also remind us that any application of Musashi's ideas must be attentive to power imbalances. In a corporate negotiation, for example, a strategy that solely focuses on winning may reinforce hierarchical oppression. Instead, a Musashi-informed approach would seek to understand the opponent's perspective, aim for a mutually beneficial outcome, and remain aware of the broader social context that shapes the negotiation. This aligns with the modern concept of integrative bargaining, where the goal is not zero-sum victory but collaborative value creation. As we draw this exploration to a close, let us reflect on the central thread that weaves through the critiques, misinterpretations, and contemporary relevance of Musashi's philosophy. The thread is the tension between the timeless insights embedded in his text and the mutable ways in which societies choose to appropriate those insights. When we allow Musashi's teachings to be flattened into a checklist of profit tactics or inflated into a mythic superhero narrative, we lose the very essence that makes his work a fertile ground for existential inquiry. Conversely, when we engage with his writings critically, honoring the feminist call to broaden the hero's image, heeding the post-colonial reminder to contextualize the samurai myth, integrating Stoic and existential perspectives, and applying his strategic principles to real-world challenges, we uncover a philosophy that is both deeply rooted in a particular historical moment and remarkably adaptable to the complexities of modern life. In the quiet moments of your own practice, whether you are sharpening a blade, drafting a proposal, teaching a class, or simply sitting with a cup of tea, ask yourself, what does the void feel like in this moment? Allow the question to linger, to open a space where the mind can rest, where preconceived strategies dissolve, and where a deeper perception can arise. In that space, Musashi's whisper, "When the spirit is not in the body, the sword cannot be drawn," echoes not as a call to violence, but as an invitation to align spirit and body, mind and action, so that whatever sword you wield, it is an expression of authentic purpose rather than a tool of ego. May this nuanced understanding of Musashi's philosophy guide you toward a path that honors both the warrior's discipline and the scholar's humility, that respects the histories that shape us, and that offers a resilient compass for navigating the ever-shifting terrain of our contemporary world.